welcome back. Now, for my Genesis Bible study folks, this thing, we taught all of the teachings that I'm going to go through in one class. But I'm actually breaking this last class up into two videos. So we're going to cover Genesis 4 in this video, and then in the next video we'll cover Genesis 6 through 9. Now, you might be noticing I'm leaving out Genesis 5. That's because Genesis 5 is a genealogy, and we will get back to that later. Also, do not be alarmed at my face. I got into a fight with something heavy, and I'm fine. So, let's just jump right on in here. Genesis 4, verse 1. Now the man had relations with Eve, his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, I produced a man with Adonai. Then she gave birth again to his brother Abel. Abel became a shepherd of flocks, while Cain became a worker of the ground. So, it's a weird way to describe having a child. Notice that Adam is nowhere in the equation. So, another translation says, with the help of the Lord, I brought forth a man. Now, Cain's the firstborn here. He would be, in Hebrew, that term is Behor, which means that he gets 2/3 of the inheritance, and he gets all the responsibility for the family, and he's got the blessing and all that stuff, right? Now, you can read this like, why would Eve phrase it like this? Do you think there might be some tension between her and Adam, between the blaming at the end of Genesis 3 and then Adam renaming her from what her identity is to what she can produce? I mean, we can certainly infer that, but I digress. Now, the word Cain means acquired, which is weird, especially if she's trying to say, me and Adonai have done this without Adam. And acquire is a weird term, right? Like, you don't use the word acquired if you just get something or if you've gotten something on your own. You use the word acquired when you've gotten it because of somebody else's assistance. Either because somebody gave you something or it's an inheritance. Because of this person, I have acquired this item. Now, as we continue, so it happened, this is verse 3, after some time that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to Adonai, while Abel, he also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Now Adonai looked favorably upon Abel and his offering, but upon Cain and his offering he did not look favorable. Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then Adonai said to Cain, why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, it will lift. But if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the doorway. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, his name means acquired. And the story moves on to tell us about this offering that they give to God. Number one, why are they even giving an offering? There's been no mandate to give an offering. The only command the Lord has given thus far, other than the consequences he doled out at the end of Genesis 3, is to be fruitful, multiply, to fill the earth and subdue it. But for some reason, Cain and Abel are bringing a sacrifice to Adonai. Now, how they're bringing this, what they're doing with it, if they're really burning it and presenting it, whether they're trying to get back and curry favor to get in the garden, we don't know. Anyway, Cain worked the soil, and then in the course of time, Cain brought forth some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought the fat portions from some firstborn of his flock, and the Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Now, I've heard it taught before that God favored Abel's offering because he brought his first and his best, and it just says that Cain brought some. But in the Hebrew, it's not clear. There's nothing wrong with thinking that. It's just not explicitly saying that. The reality is we don't know why God favored Abel's offering over Cain's. We might expect to say, when Cain brought his, to say first fruits, if it was actually the first fruits, but it doesn't necessarily need to say that. All we know for sure is that God liked Abel's offering and didn't like Cain's. And the question becomes then, how does Cain know what he's supposed to bring? I don't think there's anything in the text that tells us that God laid out how he's supposed to bring it. Now, the people who are recording this have had a whole bunch of documents delivered to them about the appropriate offerings, because if Moses is indeed writing this in the desert, then they have Leviticus, and so that has all of the sacrificial requirements in it. But if we're reading this in the mind of biblical theology, not to throw any shade at systematic theology, but if we read this with biblical theology, we can't assume that Cain and Abel know about Leviticus, right? Now, so we got to ask this, is this story about something else? Because what's even more confusing is, then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. Its desire," there's that word again, the same word we saw in Genesis 3 about Eve and the tree. "Its desire is to have you, but you must master it." Cain is in this crosswords moment. And I'm wondering if his name's significance might be here. Because Cain's whole legacy is about acquiring. And acquiring is not a bad thing. Cain could be a guy that always remembers where his gifts come from. They always come from God. Everything I have is required, right? Everything me and you have is acquired because everything comes from God. Like the fruit he's harvesting. He didn't get it himself. The Lord gave it to him. But if his name means acquires, it won't be about what he does. So how can this be spun differently? What happens if fear enters the equation of acquiring things with the help from the Lord? Now let's say you got a brother. I have a brother. And this brother is bringing some gifts that are really impressing Dad. And you know that the only thing that you have going for you is that your dad helps you get what you need. You need Dad's help. Tell me that a farmer who works in the soil and the crops, and he knows that he's dependent on what kind of elements? He's dependent on the weather, the rain, the soil. But the thing about being a farmer is, like, you have no control over any of those things, especially at this point in time in history. You don't control the sunrise, and yet you know you need the sun. You don't control the rain, but you definitely need those. At this point in time, it hasn't rained, but you know you need the water to keep coming up from the earth. So he understands that he is dependent upon Adonai to acquire anything. And we've talked about trusting the story before, which is probably what he needs to do here. Lay back, trust the story. But fear gets in the way. And he has a brother that's really winning the admiration of Dad. See, God's response to Cain is essentially, you're assuming that there's no attaboys, no good jobs, no exaltation for you because I liked your brother's sacrifice. So now Cain has a choice whether he will do good or do bad based on this moment. And be careful, because God says that sin's crouching at the door. That's actually like predatory language, like there is an animal at the door waiting to pounce. A beast of the field, if you will. I think we've seen a beast of the field come in and mess things up before. Sin, moral failure, is like an animal. It wants you. But God has called humanity to rule over the animals. That was Genesis 2. But instead they let the animals rule over them. So the question is, Cain has a chance to rule over this inner animal, this beast, this lie from the enemy that you're just a beast and nothing more. What is he going to do? See, Cain is tormented by the same doubt that the snake communicated to Eve in Genesis 3. Am I really like God? Am I really enough? Can God's generosity be trusted? Will there be blessing for all of us? There's also something else going on here. So we talked about a little bit last week how this snake that's in the garden is more than just a snake. It seems to be a spiritual being. And we talked about, in the grand scheme of things, whether you believe like I do that spiritual beings were created on day 4, or whether you believe that they were created pre-creation, they were still here first. Humans, our race, are exalted secondborns. We were the last things created, and we were given the honor of being created in the image of God. Genesis 3 lays out the rivalry between the fallen spiritual beings and humans, and the temptation for both to act independently of the will of God, to give in to their beastly natures and to take for themselves. There's an interesting kind of tension right here in the discomfort of firstborns when Adonai elevates people who seem undeserving. It's easy for us to look at Adonai and all of this generosity, and when he gives it to somebody else, to fear that there won't be enough left for us. What we need to understand is that God and his resources and his generosity are inexhaustible. And just because he's more generous to one person or group does not mean that he won't be generous to us too. Now, Cain is at this point where he doesn't feel accepted. He sees his brother as this major threat to his success. So in his mind, he's thinking that if he's going to be blessed by God, something has to change. Fear is the antithesis of trust. When fear enters the story, it paralyzes us in our ability to trust God's goodness. If Cain's whole identity is about what does it mean to inquire, instead of trusting in the story and delighting in God's provision, he now feels threatened. He sees Abel and thinks that he's not good enough, that he doesn't measure up. The only way to measure up is to eliminate Abel. And God comes to him at this moment he's thinking about this crossroads, and asks him, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? Now, let's pick it back up in verse 8. Cain spoke to Abel his brother while they were in the field. Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then Adonai had said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? I don't know, he said. Am I my brother's keeper? Then he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. So now cursed are you from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. As often as you work the ground, it will not yield its crops to you again. You will be restless, be a restless wanderer on the earth. And you get this curse that it sounds very similar to the curse of Adam, well, the consequences of Adam in Genesis 3. Because these are just more consequences. But everything seems to circle around this idea of Cain, why is your face downcast and why are you so angry? One of the things that I've noticed as I've read the story is, why does God ask why he's angry? Because we can tell you why he's angry. His mom sinned, humanity's fallen, he's hopeless, he's angry because he hasn't pleased God, and there's lots of other reasons why he's angry. He's having to work hard to bring forth fruit from the soil, with tilling and planting and all the things. Yet this story is like such a good story. Because what this proves to me is that God's love, God's feelings on humanity haven't changed, but humanity's feelings about itself has. Now, how do I reckon that? If you remember when we talked about Adam and Eve, their big thing was their nakedness, right? The shame that entered into the world in Genesis 3. God meets them there, right where they're at, kills an innocent animal and gives them clothes. God's feelings haven't changed. They were banished from the garden, but it appears that they weren't completely separated from God, because God's still here. Now, not in the same capacity. No. The story doesn't tell us that the nature of God has changed. It's the nature of humanity. Humanity's feelings about themselves have changed. The way they view themselves has changed because they now have shame. They are now downcast. They are now angry. What God's position here is coming to Cain in grace and in mercy and in love and saying, Cain, you can do everything you need to do right now. You don't have to let the way that you're feeling get in the way of who I created you to be. Otherwise, why even ask the question? God says, if you do what is right, you will be commended. But if you don't do what's right, God doesn't say if you do what's right, it'd be commended. But if you do what's wrong, God simply is focused on him doing what is right. Cain, my feelings for you haven't changed. You're still loved and accepted. I don't love Abel more. I like to sacrifice. I don't love Abel more because I like to sacrifice, and I didn't like yours today. But you just have to do what's right, Cain. Bring another sacrifice. Try again. Don't worry about what happened today. Think about what's going to happen tomorrow. Think about that I'm still going to provide you food. I'm still going to provide you clothing. I'm still going to provide you love. You're still just as accepted and loved and valued as you were before you brought the sacrifice. So what's God really asking him? Well, let's look at what he says. Sin is crouching at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Again, it's the same idea that we've ran into in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3. Cain, just because you have desire, and just because you have fear, because you have anxiety, insecurity, doubt, whatever, does not mean that you're a beast. You can say enough. I'm not going to let my emotions control my actions because I'm made in the image of God. And I'm going to trust that God loves me just as much now as he did before. The invitation we keep saying over and over again is to trust that God is good, that God's a provider, and that God's going to take care of us. Yet again, the story doesn't end that way. We're going to watch through the next several sessions as people give into their desires and their fears and their insecurities instead of trusting the story. It's not this whole thing that you have to completely change yourself because you messed up one time. And I'm not talking about sin here. I'm talking about if you believe in Jesus, if you trust the story, if you've trusted in his love and goodness, and you mess up. It's this idea that we feel like when we meet Jesus that we're standing looking at Jesus, right? And then every time we sin, that the sin is getting piled up in this big pile in between us and him. And that he's somehow on the other side of this and we can't see him and he can't see us because all of our junk is in the middle, right? When in reality, think about Genesis 2. Jesus is standing right next to us. And he's looking at us and he's saying, hey man, let's work on this together. I still love you. And I feel like the Father, Adonai, is saying to Cain, just do it right tomorrow. Yeah, you messed up today. Yeah, I didn't accept your sacrifice today. But it doesn't mean I don't accept you. Remember last week we talked about when God comes into the garden after the fall and he asks, where are you? And there's two different ways to say where are you in the Hebrew. There's the where are you, like, hey, where's my pen? And then there's the where are you as to say, oh, I put my pen here. Who's moved it? Why isn't it where it's supposed to be? It's the second phrase that the Lord says when he asks Cain, where is your brother Abel? There's lots of similarities here. So, we see Cain kill Abel. Yahweh asked him this question. And now we get into this point. We're going to start to see some things happen. Cain goes off. Adonai exiles him, but promises to protect him 7 times over if anyone decides to harm him. So Cain travels east, builds a city, names it after his firstborn son. And we start to feel the tone change a little bit. We start to see some signs that even though the Lord has ordered the chaos, that the chaos is trying to make a comeback. The evil that is now starting with Cain progresses through his descendants. And we will talk more about that in our next video. Anyway, thank y'all for being here. We'll see you soon.